Me of this anecdote, which is probably untrue but convenient, in which a British general addresses his troops and he says, "Men, we have no more money. Now we must think." So one can only hope that the silver lining in the MBTA's current financial crisis is that we start to use some smart ideas. But to get to the point where we start to use some smart ideas, I think we have to get past the financial crisis, because I think that at least in Boston, instead of promoting good thinking in the agency, I think there's great thinking, but outside the agency, there tends to be a sort of sense of, oh, well, you know, we can't do anything interesting, we're sort of broke. And certainly in California, where the San Francisco, the BART system went through a very similar financial crisis and has actually kind of climbed out of it with a lot of public support for transit investment. They're now doing much more of this kind of forward-looking, okay, great, now that we can actually have the transit system that we all dreamed of because we've put some resources behind it, you know, what kind of transit system do we, the people of San Francisco, want? So, for example, the city charter of San Francisco actually establishes transit priority in the charter of the city of San Francisco. So there's a lot we can do, and we want to get to that, but if we're going to get to that, we got to get to the problem, which is we have built finance for transportation in the state of Massachusetts, and I would note, not just for the T, for the regional transit agencies and for our roads and bridges. We have built it on House of Cards. We have built it by maxing out credit cards with no clue how we are going to make the minimum payments on the cards, let alone ever pay off the balance, and the bills have all come due. Every trick that could possibly be used to delay the day of reckoning has been used twice, and we're out of time. And so not only is this year a bad year, which is why the T is holding all these hearings and asking people, you know, how much pain would you like to have inflicted on you? Next year will be worse. So when a group of us talked to the general manager, the acting general manager of the T yesterday, he said he doesn't think he can wait until January of 2013 to start having hearings on the next round of fare increases and service cuts unless the legislature gives him money. He figures he'll be back having public hearings in the fall. And that's after they implement the current round of proposals. So what my hope is that the short-term conversation that we're having now, that sort of grinds to a halt sometime in April when somehow or another we decide what the fares are going to be and which buses we're going to keep running, turns into this long-term conversation, and that everybody in this room and all your friends get involved in not only the short-term conversation, like the 4,000 people who showed up at the public hearings, but the long-term conversation, which is how are we actually going to pay off the credit card bills and get back into the business of fixing and improving our transit system instead of being in the business of fighting across communities and bus routes whose bus gets to, you know, stay and whose bus gets cut. So this is a primer called Maxed Out. It's a primer on transportation finance in Massachusetts. You can find it on the Dukakis Center website. We worked on it with a coalition called Transportation for Massachusetts. It's on their website. Transportation finances is really complicated, but I just want to show you this. This is the only thing you have to see. You see this little wedge here? This circle represents $1 billion in debt service. That's paying principal and interest on bonds. None of that is the T's debt. So you know you keep hearing the big dig debt, T has to pay the big dig debt. That $1 billion, okay, is the debt we're paying for the Mass Turnpike and the highway system and the bridges. The state collects $1.4 billion a year from all of the gasoline taxes, all of the fees you pay to the Registry of Motor Vehicle, and part of the sales tax. So we're using 3/4 of that money to pay off debt before we spend a penny filling a pothole, okay? So I say that at the beginning because while I'm a huge advocate of transit, I am also actually a huge advocate of functional roads and bridges, if for no other reason that the vast majority of transit trips made in Massachusetts are actually made in buses, and they go on roads and bridges. And some of the bridges that are in the worst structural condition in Massachusetts are the ones that are owned by the MBTA, because the MBTA is so broke that it doesn't fix its own bridges, and they're not eligible for the money that the rest of the state road agency uses to fix bridges. So even if you care more about transit, don't be one of these transit advocates who says, oh, I don't care about the roads, I just care about transit. But let's now turn to the T. Okay, so you've probably heard there's this thing called forward funding. We changed the rules of the game in 2000. the thing, I was actually involved. I was working at the time. I was not in academia at the time. I was working for an environmental group, so I was in the negotiations. The thing you have to understand is, as much as forward funding has not like worked out, before forward funding, every single year the MBTA had to go with its hat in hand to the Massachusetts legislature and say, "Hi, we need $300 million. We need $200 million. We need $400 million." And every year, the legislature did actually give them the money. Well, that's not actually true. There was 1 year that they didn't, and they shut the T in the middle of December because they just ran out of money before the end of the calendar year, and they couldn't spend any until January. And a lot of us were getting worried that the legislature was so fed up that they really were going to, one day, they were just going to say, "We're just not going to give it to you. You figure it out." So while forward funding created some of the problems we're seeing today, it gave the MBTA 1 penny of the sales tax that is paid statewide. That amounts to $750 million a year that the T now has that it didn't have before forward funding. So another thing that I try to tell people when I'm trying to teach them a little bit about this financial mess is, don't believe these people who tell you forward funding was just a bad thing and it only caused problems, because $750 million, even in politics, is actually real money, right? And nobody can take that away from the T. And we've been through some big financial crises in the state since then, and they have not touched 1 penny of that money. The problem is, it's only $750 million, and the T needs more than that to operate. That's the first thing you need to know. So we have this legislation, they get a penny of the sales tax, but the trade-off was, you now have to pay your own way. So if you want to fix things, if you want to buy new, Orange Line trains, or you want to fix the signal system or whatever, you issue bonds and you have to pay back the bondholders. And by the way, we had this pile of $3 or $4 billion in bonds that we spent on transit before you existed in this new form, and we're just going to give those to you. So you pay for those and issue new bonds and pay for them. So the good thing is they gave them money, but they also then gave them this stack of credit card bills, and what it turns out is the credit card bills cost more than the amount of money they gave them, so every year the MBTA just falls farther and farther behind. The other thing is, we've been talking for these 24 public hearings about the operating budget. That's a budget that the T uses every year to run the trains and the buses. But that's not their own, and that budget is it's out of balance. It runs a deficit. This year's deficit is $161 million. Next year's deficit is $200 million. 4 years from now, the projected deficit is $300 million. So if we raise fares and we collect another couple $100 million in fares, it won't be enough. But a transit system can't just operate, because you also have to repair the buses you have, buy new buses when they get too old, and sometimes you might want to build something new, like the Green Line extension in Somerville, right? So the T actually has to do 4 things with the money it has, right? It's just like trying to balance your own budget. They have to operate the system. They have to pay for their credit card debt. They have to pay the bonds they've issued. They have to keep the system from falling apart. That's called a state of good repair. The T should be spending $700 or $800 million a year just to keep the system it has in a state of good repair. They can't afford to spend more than $400 million, and that $450 million, all of it comes from issuing new bonds. They cannot spend 1 penny towards that $700 million out of the money you pay in fares. So they keep having, their debt gets bigger, the credit card bills, because they keep charging the fixing part. And even then, it's falling apart. And then finally, if you actually believe that transit is a good thing and you would like to invest some money in signal prioritization or buying new buses or giving people in Somerville better service, none of that is in the budget. So if we solve sort of the crisis du jour and we sort of figure out how to raise the fares, which buses to cut, all that does is address the first bullet, the operating budget, and only for this year. When we're done, we haven't touched the debt service, the state of good repair, or strategic investment, and we can't get to next year. Depressed yet? Okay. The other thing you have to know about transit is you lose money on every passenger. So one of the reasons that the T is running a deficit is that ridership is at an all-time high. Now, you lose different amounts of money on different passengers. So every bus passenger on average has to be subsidized $3.33 a trip. So again, I don't like paying higher fares any more than you do, but I gotta tell you something. $1.50 for a bus trip But you pay that $1.50. Taxpayers in Pittsfield, Massachusetts are contributing part of this $3.33 every time you ride the bus, okay? A little bit less for the subway, a little bit more for those commuter rail riders. We like them, but we don't charge them enough. And this is the RIDE paratransit system, okay? So, transit should be subsidized. If you have taken one of our fine economics classes here at Northeastern University, you know that there are things called public goods. And the idea of a public good is it's a good that everybody benefits from, but if you had to buy it with your own money, you would never buy enough of it because you benefit and you benefit and you benefit. Transit is a public good. It will never pay for itself. It should never pay for itself. It doesn't pay for itself in Zurich, and it doesn't pay for itself in the Netherlands, and it doesn't pay for itself in Hong Kong. Okay? It just doesn't. We have to subsidize it. But it's a deal. We have to strike a deal. The people who use it have to pay for part of the deal, and everybody else has to pay for part of the deal too. So your fares this is last year's budget, covered $451 million of the MBTA's roughly $1.5 billion budget. So that's a lot of money, but it's not a big percentage of the budget. And it's particularly not a big percentage of the budget when you take into account the fact that the T spends $405 million of that on debt service. So roughly speaking, in round numbers, between friends, every penny you pay in fares just pays for the bonds. And that's the bonds we already issued. That's not the other $500 million in bonds we'll issue this year to fix the system. So this is why I say it's a house of cards. You can't keep going this way, where we collect all these fares, we just pay off the bonds, it doesn't pay to operate the system, it doesn't pay to fix the system, and we have to borrow more on our credit cards. And not only that, because you issue bonds and then you pay them for a long time, it doesn't get any better. So that red line is the $400 million mark, and the earliest the T gets below the $400 million mark is like the year 2020, but this chart assumes they don't issue any more bonds, and they're going to issue more bonds like this year, and next year, and the year after that. March, Friday tells me they're going to issue more bonds in March, so that would be next week. So this is just paying off the old bonds, okay? The T has more bonds than any transit system in the United States, because right now, depends how you count, there's about, if you could pay them all off tomorrow, it would be like $5.6 billion in bonds. If you don't pay them all off tomorrow and you pay out the interest over time, it's like $8 billion. People say, well, what are we going to do? You can't just pay off $5.6 billion overnight. So we used to have a state agency called the Massachusetts Turnpike Authority. And you may not know this, but we don't have a state agency called the Massachusetts Turnpike Authority anymore. It went away in November of 2009. It just was abolished by the legislature. And the day it went away, it had bonds. It had nearly $3 billion, I believe, in bonds. And guess what? They went away overnight on November 1st of 2009. So when people say to me, you can't just make $5.6 billion in bonds go away, I say, what we did for the Massachusetts Turnpike, the T's at least as important as the Massachusetts Turnpike. More people use the T every day than the Massachusetts Turnpike. So yeah, we can, but we got to deal with it. And the other thing is, again, if we want to keep spending money, this is the money the T spends on repairs and investments, well, their 5-year plan assumes that they're going to have to issue another $757 million in bonds. State taxpayers are going to have to issue another $1.2 billion. And oh, by the way, we think the federal government is going to give us nearly $2 billion in bonds, except for that the Republican majority in the House is in the process of trying to remove all federal funding for transit right now. Although thankfully Speaker Boehner seems to have backed down on that. So we're counting on half of all of our money to fix the system coming from a federal government that may or may not be interested in sending that much money for transit to Massachusetts, and we want to build all of this new stuff, right? So where does that leave us? I just want to spend 1 minute because, again, I use the T, I have a pass. As you all know, Northeastern does not subsidize my pass. It's kind enough to, give it to me when I start my job, but I pay for my pass. So I don't want to pay more fares, but I want to show you why we probably all have to pay a little bit more in fares. So this is the proposal, and I or Josh or Brian can all answer you more questions about that. So this is the interesting thing. For about a century, we paid the same fare in Massachusetts. It's actually this chart, one of my grad students did it. It's just an amazing chart because green is the inflation-adjusted fare, and it's been roughly the same from 1897 till 2007, more or less. I just find that's unbelievable, okay? And it's going to be higher than that, but the truth is, historically, paying $1.50 in 2012 isn't all that different than when it went from a nickel to a dime and poor Charlie couldn't get off the MBTA because he didn't have the nickel. It's about the same. There are not that many things that even in inflation-adjusted dollars cost what they cost in 1897, okay? So you gotta think about that. The other thing is, we are the only big city transit agency, and I apologize to Baltimore because they're the only other one that hasn't raised fares, that has not raised fares at least once in the last 5 years. Most of them have raised fares twice, okay? And there's something called a fare recovery ratio, which is the percentage of the budget that the fares cover. And this chart is actually fare recovery ratios if you take the debt away. Because so many people say the problem is the big debt, that it's important to say, actually, fares are only covering a small, 30-something% of the T's budget, taking away all the debt service, okay? So that you can compare it to the other transit agencies that don't have debt service. Now, officially in this state, our policy has been that fares should cover about half the budget. That's that yellow line, and what you'll see is we've never achieved that, and it's just getting worse. It's getting lower. The blue and red lines are two different ways of calculating it. So the truth is, we probably need to raise fares. Hopefully not as much as the T has proposed, and hopefully we don't need to raise fares and eliminate a quarter of the bus system at the same time. So I want to close with two thoughts. One is, Northeastern University is one of the biggest beneficiaries of the MBTA. We basically have two stops all to ourselves, one on the green line, one of the orange line. I will note that the university was not ecstatic when the orange line stop was proposed, okay? They actually didn't want it. Thank goodness they were wrong, or they were overridden, essentially. Our university should be out there as an advocate for transit, because this university's lifeblood is the transit system. And I just want to give you one example of the way the world works in Chicago. So in Chicago, they have the Chicago Transit Authority. And in Chicago, every major university has agreed to a program called the Universal Pass Program. And this is how it works. They count how many registered students they have every semester, and they mail the Chicago Transit Authority $100 times the number of registered students. In return, your ID card gets you on every train and bus operated by the Chicago Transit Authority for the entire semester, $100 a head, okay? The monthly pass after this next fare increase will cost roughly $80, okay? The reason they can do it for $100 a semester is because it's every student, every faculty member, every staff member. Most of them will never get on a train, right? So at $100 a student, the transit agency makes money on the deal. But more important, and the students get great transit access, but more importantly, the transit agency can budget, because if every university in the city of Chicago does that, then they know twice a year they get big checks all at once. They don't have to worry, do people buy the passes, do they not, do they fare evasion, do they get on the back door? They just get their money in two big checks. MIT is actually piloting this program right now in Massachusetts. I have been told repeatedly by the MBTA that no other university has been willing to volunteer to pilot this program. I think Northeastern University should volunteer to pilot this program. I want my Husky card to be a Charlie card. That's a concrete thing. There are, Barry, we calculated this, 300,000 registered students in the Boston area. 330,000. We did a little GIS mapping. Probably 200,000 of those goes to universities that are well served by the T. 200,000 students times $100 a semester is a $20 million check arriving at the MBTA twice a year. Twice a year, okay? That's real money. So, the last thought I will close is we need what the hearings have taught us all, including, I think, a lot of our elected representatives, is that as much as we all bitch and moan and complain about the tea, with good reason sometimes, sorry Josh. If you try to take it away from us, or tell us that you can't afford to provide it, people really do care. People value the service. That's an important step forward towards solving the problem. But they're not going to be solved unless you and your friends and everyone at this university, everyone in the city gives the tea what it really needs the most. More than dollars, more than riders, help. Help the tea. Thank you.